This video is made possible by the generous support of Dave Myers at GatorFoam.net, who supplied the Gator foam used for this project. I hope this video will convince you of the flexibility and usefulness of Gator foam and that you will support Dave. His contact information will be included in the description below. Hi everybody, I'm Joe Parker of the Pixel Depot, and welcome back to my series on building a small HO scale layout called what are we calling it again? The Grunge. I can't remember. Anyway, in our last full episode we put the backdrop up, and in my last update I showed how I shored that backdrop up a little bit to make sure that it would stay put. At the end of the last full episode, the benchwork was complete and the backdrop was up, but the benchwork base was still plain white. There was a surface to put things on, but it too was still plain white, and it wasn't attached to anything, so it was a bit uneven. In this episode, we're going to paint everything, finalize the sub-roadbed, and put down the track. We've got a lot of mileage to cover today, so let's get moving. In model railroading, you're going to come across the terms roadbed and sub-roadbed. Some people, especially beginners, either get confused about or simply don't know what these terms refer to, so let's cover some basics here. This graphic should help. Wrong graphic! What's wrong with you guys? Roadbed refers to what the track sits on and is attached to. That material could be any number of things, but typical options you'll find on a model railroad are cork, foam, or some other product like Homosote, which is a board made from recycled newspapers. Roadbed material is often used to raise the track off the structural surface. Real railroads use ballast on moderate to heavily traveled routes to raise the track up, since drainage is important. Roadbed often mimics this. It also is often used to deaden noise, since trains running over certain materials without a sound deadener can create bumps, clunks, or echoes. Subroadbed is more of a model railroad term and refers to what is underneath the roadbed. That is, what's providing strength and support for the track on the layout itself. Again, you'll find all kinds of things like plywood, extruded foam insulation, Homosote again, and others. On the Monument City Terminal Division, I use acoustic ceiling tiles. I've seen all kinds of options. On the Grunge, we're going to be using Gator foam. To confuse matters, sometimes the roadbed and sub-roadbed are either the same material, or one or the other is only used. This is the case here, where we'll be attaching the track directly to the Gator foam without anything else in between them. Little used lines and industrial trackage often have minimal ballast, or none at all, with the ties buried directly in the ground. This is the look we'll be going for with the Grunge. Before we go further, if you haven't already, why not subscribe by clicking the button below. This channel covers model railroading, including planning, hints, tips, how-tos, and updates. Click on the bell and you'll get notified when there's new content available. So I want to be able to lock down the tops here and still make them removable to access things if I have to for wiring and so on. Most of the time it'll be easier to flip the whole layout over to access those things, but there may be times where I want to do that. So I'm going to drill holes. I've measured out where the corners are that will match up with the 3/4 by 3/4 inch blocks that are in the corners for support. In most of these cases, if not all, there will be scenery or a structure hiding that screw, so there shouldn't be any issues and I won't have to try and cover them up. I wanted the layout to have a finished look, so I decided to paint both the sub-roadbed as well as the benchwork base. I started with the sub-roadbed, which I painted a flat, dark tan color that I thought would be similar to dirt. The benchwork itself is painted black and has a little sheen to it. Here are the names and formulas of the paint that I used, and I'll include the information in the description below. So in the interest of full disclosure, after I painted everything and brought it back into the house, this joint here came loose. So I'm going to repair that. This is going to work out in my favor. This particular joint had, when I attached it initially, was a little high. It dried higher than the regular level, and therefore the surface wasn't quite sitting flush. Even though I didn't intend for this to come loose, I think it's actually going to work out well. Make sure that it's relatively flush. attach this in here and let it dry. Okay, one thing I did not take into account when I was painting was that that was going to cover the pencil marks that I used to reline the backdrop up. So I'm going to, I don't know how I'm going to do this. Alright, I tried to mark this with regular pencil. I tried to mark it with white colored pencil. This is a fairly smooth surface with a sheen on it, and it's not taking that, so I'm going with a marker. So for this purpose, I'm just going to draw a dot here. We will then take off the backdrop once again. So using that mark, I'm going to put a line here that will drop below the 1 inch, as I did before. May not be perfect, but it will definitely help me align things. And then we'll reattach. And now I'm going to attach the sub-roadbed to the benchwork. This will drill the screws down into those corner braces that I drilled out earlier. So you can see here I was originally going to use the same number 6 1¼ inch screws that I used to attach the backdrop to the benchwork. For the rest of the layout I decided to use 1 inch long drywall screws. So here's how the layout looks with the painting complete and the sub-roadbed screwed down. We're almost ready to lay track, but let's cover some of the basic materials and tools we'll be using first. We're using Flextrack on this layout for everything but the turnouts. It's called Flextrack because it's flexible and can be cut and shaped to fit whatever you need, unlike sectional track, which comes in small pre-measured sections and of a set shape. It works because one rail is attached to the ties while the other rail is allowed to float. Some brands and or sizes of Flextrack come with pre-drilled holes on some of the ties. That's the case with the Atlas Code 100 track that we'll be using here, for example. This is to make it easier to attach the rail to the sub-roadbed with track nails. You can also drill your own holes. I use a pin vise with a small drill bit roughly the size of the track nails for when I'm drilling. We use rail joiners between track sections to make sure the track aligns. There are 2 basic kinds of rail joiners, metal joiners and plastic joiners. The metal ones allow power to run between sections of track, but as you'll see in a later video, we're not going to rely solely on that to power our rails. The plastic joiners are typically used to insulate one area of track from another. This is particularly important if your layout has any return loops, since the reversing loop will cause a short. Everything on the Grunge is point-to-point, and nothing turns back on itself, so we can get away with using only metal joiners. This is a piece of Flextrack right out of the box. You can see if I attempt to put a rail joiner on the end, there isn't enough room to get the joiner on the end at all, much less solidly. If we tried to put 2 sections of track together like this, it would never work. So to fix this problem, we often have to remove ties from the ends of the section of Flextrack we're working with. I do this with a tool called a Craftsman Handy Cut, but you can use any tool you like to cut the plastic ties. Now with the ties removed, the joiner slides on easily and will join 2 pieces of track without a gap. These are the tools we're using to lay our track. You don't have to use exactly these tools, but these are the ones that I use. I'll explain why and more about each one as we go along. Now, finally, we can move on to laying track. Laying track is exciting since this is where the layout will really start to take shape. But it can also be a scary step as it's the first thing that sort of feels permanent about the layout. There can be a bit of a mental hurdle to get across. Even I hesitated getting started myself, and I've done this a bunch of times. But as you'll see, it turned out fine. And if you feel yourself holding back because you fear making a mistake, push through it. There's no point in getting cold feet at this point. So what I've done here is printed out at a 1-to-1 ratio the track plan, and this includes the updates that I did to the track plan in that update video. So this spur here is in the proper location, adjusted for the new building location, setback. The tavern will go here, and so the street's been moved and all those things that I discussed in that video. I'm going to go with the original printout that I had here. This was before I did the track plan update. And you can see that the center line on this track over here is just about dead on 5 inches. The center line on this one is about 8 7/10 if I look at that pretty closely. So what I've done here, I don't know if you can see it or not, is I've marked those locations here on the Subroadbed. The other thing that I've done is marked roughly based on this measurement here, where that track will end over here. Actually, maybe I did not do that. So I'll mark that on the front here. Based on the new spur location, this one will end roughly here, and I've already marked that there. What I'll do, since you can see these are pretty much dead straight lines here, is every so far I will mark the 5 inches and 8 7/10 inches all the way to the end. I'm not going to mark the location of these spurs because although I roughly know where this one's going to go based on the size of the building, I want to be able to place the building in there before I actually tack it down. So we'll put some Flextrack in there and we'll go from there. The next step will be to take the 4-foot straight edge and mark this out. Now I'm going to mark where the turnouts are supposed to be located. And this is a little trickier because it's not just a straight line. Again, this doesn't have to be perfectly aligned as long as things fit in there pretty well. I could have done this before I marked the center lines. You can really do that either way. But this will at least allow me to know where the ends of the turnouts are supposed to be located. Now I can take these turnouts and start to lay them out. Got 3 right hands, 3 left hands. As it works out, all the left hands are on one side, all the right hands are on the other side of the layout. Again, I'm using these lines as the center line for these. Once again, I'm using Pico switches. These are number 5 switches. They don't label them that way. They call them small radius turnouts. I'm using Atlas code 100 track, and I'll be using Atlas rail joiners to join it all together. Like I said, I've got some of these scraps here. I don't know if I'll be able to use any of these at all. So what I've done previously here is drill some holes in the switches. You can see that in the last tie there, the small hole, big enough for a track nail. The turnouts don't come with any holes drilled in them, but for the purposes of tacking things down, they can be handy, so you can just drill them in if you need to. I won't likely be keeping the track nails in here. Again, they'll be handy for when we're tacking things down here so things don't move around too much. But once you put the ballast and ground foam and all the scenic materials down, that's going to hold the track in place better than the nails will. The nails will look unsightly in close-up shots and things like that. You could leave them in, you could take them out. I think given the size of this layout and the detail that I'm looking to go for in terms of photographs and video and so on, I will end up taking them out. My handy magnet here with the track nails on it. I'm not going to deafen you guys with the noises of me banging things in, so we'll do this at high speed. Okay, so most of these are now at least tacked down. With the gator foam, the surface, the veneer here holds the nails pretty well, but you can see I can pull it out. Oops. I can pull it out here and move it around if I need to. I left this one floating just because there's going to be a couple of tight pieces going in here, and I thought it would be easier to be able to play around with those. This piece should be just about the right size. This couldn't be more perfect. I know it doesn't necessarily look like it, but if I was to remove this last tie, there we go. Now it should come off. So without that tie on there, you can see that the overlap is very, very minimal. And what I typically do is I will mark it. This isn't the easiest thing to do with a camera in the way, but I will mark this here, and then I will use my Dremel tool to cut this off. This is a rotary tool. This has an extension on it. That's what this flexible piece is on here. The tool itself is this section up to about here. All this is a motor that spins really fast. It's adjustable. This happens to be by a company called Dremel. There are other brands out there. Dremel's probably the best known. Not affiliated with Dremel, just the one that I happen to have. I've also put cutoff wheels on this. Those are cutoff wheels. They come in packages. I usually double them up because it makes them a little stronger. They do tend to shatter fairly easily, and especially if they're singles, they'll shatter. The shattering is one reason I have these on. The second reason is that as I cut this, there's going to be little shards of metal that come flying off. I've had enough things hit me in the face while I'm doing this that I don't want to take any chances with my eyeballs. I only have the two, and I'd really like to keep them until I'm done on this earth. So even with the glasses, I always wear the safety glasses when I'm using this particular tool. You don't have to use this tool. There are rail nippers, pliers that have blades on them that are available as well. I personally find that to be slower and not quite as neat, but everybody has their own personal preference, and your mileage may vary. I put this piece of wood here so that when I cut through with the cutoff wheel, it doesn't damage the surface of the layout. I've also zoomed in here quite close so that you can see the marks that I've put on the rail. That's where I'm going to be trimming the rail, and when I'm done, that should provide me a nice snug fit with this straight piece of track between the two turnouts. If it doesn't, we will trim it a little more. If it ends up too short, we'll have to cut another piece of rail. Nope, need to take just a hair off on both sides. That will fit nicely. The other thing to keep in mind when using the rotary tool is, especially with the metal rail, the longer you're grinding it, the more the rail is going to heat up. So if you're touching the rail, you could end up burning your fingers. Be careful of that. Now we will grab some rail joiners here. Before we do that, I'm going to have to cut another tie off because I don't have enough room. You know what? I'm going to trim just a little bit more off of this because that is quite tight in there. And if there's any kind of expansion at all, that could be a problem. So there's a small gap in there, but that will work out just fine. Assuming I can get the rail joiners on. There we go. I will need to pull this end up just a tad. And we will get those in there. Find that hole again. And now we have a nice snug fit. It might be a 1/16 of an inch on each end, which will give it some play, some expansion and contraction if needed. And while we are here, we will tack this piece of Flextrack down. Again, we're just tacking this down. There's no need at this point to really nail everything in place, especially until we make sure that everything fits. And we will end up repeating this process numerous times until we get all the track in. Okay, so all that took about an hour, and I've done a couple of things here. So I've put in this spur here, the one down at the far end. They're just sort of tacked in there because, again, I'm not sure exactly how long they're going to be or exactly where they're going to fit up in there. I want to be able to adjust that as I go. Second thing I did was leave some gap here on the end so that I can put a plate in there when I am going to be operating. So on this end of the layout, there will be a fiddle stick that goes off to the end. It'll be 36 inches long, and that will attach in, so I'll have a connector plate that will connect this track to the track on the fiddle stick. So the last thing that's remaining are these two connector areas, and I left those just because they may take a little bit of fiddling. I've got these two small remnants of track. They'll both fit in quite nicely. I'll still have to trim them down, but that will be all that's left for the initial track laying. One thing I want to mention here that I probably should have mentioned at the beginning is when I'm cutting track like this, what I will typically do is attach one end with the rail joiners so that you've got a solid, sturdy connection to go with. And this one, interestingly enough, is going to be a little difficult. And the reason for that is, I don't know if you can see this, but the ties are butting up against each other here and won't let it fit in. The easy solution for that is to just cut the edge of this tie off. But now it'll fit in there quite nicely. So now I can measure where this is going to be and mark it appropriately, knowing that this other end is going to be in here pretty solidly and will not move around. Okay, so I've trimmed this off a couple of ways here. As I trimmed that tie off before, I've trimmed this one as well. And I wanted to show you this part as well, just because, you know, I'm going to have to take another tie off of there. It's just not going to fit. So we will chop that off there, pull that tie off, and then we should get a better fit. Now, if you'll recall, this turnout is tacked down, this turnout is tacked down. In order to get this in there, we are going to have to play a little bit. And perhaps I should have waited to tack all these down, but we'll see how this goes. We'll lift this up. Do this the easier way and actually put the rail joiners on the turnout. That way I should be able to play with this a little bit more. So I'm bending this track all over the place and it's popped out in various places, but once I lay all this down again, these should all go back into the places where they were, and now that connector is in place. The other thing I want to mention here as well is that we've got these large gaps here, and what we can do is trim, actually that one's cut, so I don't want that one, but we can trim these ties. They have knobs on them that you can see that is what holds the track in place. And we will sand that off, or grind it off, whatever you want to do, and then just slip those underneath. The other option is that there are plenty of sources for individual ties available. A lot of times they're cut out of laser cut wood or whatever, but the most economical way is to just trim these down. So what we've got here is the sprue cutters. We will trim this down, flatten it out on both sides. So that'll take the bulk off. Then with my trusty emery board, one of my favorite sanding tools, we will sand that down. Again on the other side. So I've flattened those out now, not completely, but close enough, and So now we should be able to, for example, slide this right under here, and that tie will sit there and fill in that gap. Doesn't really matter if it's out of alignment very much. We'll go from there. And you end up cutting so many of these off from just trimming the ends of the Flextrack that you generally have enough to go and work. So we'll use these to fill in the gaps. So now we'll do the other end and wrap it up. With the track in place and tacked down, you'll want to run some cars over the joints and through the turnouts to make sure everything is smooth and flows well without bumps, jumps, or derailments. It can be easy when you're putting things together to miss a rail joiner or misalign a rail joiner, leaving the track uneven, or even to have a gap that's too large between track sections. Trust me, now is the time to fix any problems before we go any further in the project. They'll only get harder to fix from here, and nothing will kill your enthusiasm for building and operating a layout as track problems will. So there we are. The track is laid. The Grunge is really starting to look like something. I used 6 turnouts and 6 pieces of Flextrack for this layout. Laying the track took me a little over an hour. That's part of the beauty of a small layout. Progress is quick. The next step is to do the wiring. As you know from watching this series, wiring is my favorite thing to do, and of course I'm an expert at it, so this should go perfectly. Meanwhile, I'm also working on finalizing the layout's industries and the structures that will represent them. That's all for this episode. As I mentioned, starting to lay track can be a mental obstacle, but I hope I've shown you it's not as bad as it might seem. With a little patience, you can have rock-solid track work, which will ensure reliable operation. Finally, if you enjoyed this video and think others would as well, click the thumbs up to like it and leave a comment. This lets me know I'm on the right track, so to speak, and will help put this channel in front of a wider audience. I'm Joe Parker of the Pixel Depot. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you'll meet me next time in the train room. There we go. The bend is ever so slight, but enough. Yeah, maybe it isn't. Maybe I just made all that up. So there you go.